I'm doing nothing but having a peaceful protest. Here we go. Go!
A protest is a public expression of objection, disapproval towards an idea or course of action, typically a political one. Protests can take many different forms, from individual statements to mass demonstrations. Hundreds of thousands of people have protested against police brutality and the systemic racism that contributed to the deaths of George Floyd and many others. The protests in response to Floyd's death that began on May 26, 2020, have been some of the most intense in U.S. history. His murder was a tragic horror, and the break that broke the camel's back. The fact that it was captured on video compelled all Americans to face that horror directly. Black Americans saw themselves or their loved ones in that video. In that and other videos, many white Americans finally saw the racism, brutality, unfairness, and this became a global movement since then. Protests and activism have been brought to the forefront of South African society, after 19-year-old Nene was raped and murdered in August by a post office employee Boda, wearing all black, brandishing placards and singing apartheid-era struggle songs took to the streets of Johannesburg to demonstrate against what they called the scourge of femicide in South Africa. Thousands of protesters demand action on violence against women. The 2019 Latin American protests correspond to a series of protests all over Latin America that coincided in the same year, and that is part of a larger context of international contestation movements since the end of 2018. Some of these protests continued into 2020. The economic and political corruptions led to demanding of democracy, regime change, and more effective investments rather than austerity. On Friday, March 15, 2019, things started and voices have raised during Hong Kong protests. Over two-thirds of people in Hong Kong don't see themselves as Chinese. Also, Hong Kong has different statute than the other Chinese territories since it was colonized by the British for decades. The country has seen several months of pro-democracy protests, and China appears to be tightening its grip, so there are a lot of reasons behind China going in aggressively. The Catalan independence movement is a social and political movement with roots in Catalan nationalism, which seeks the independence of Catalonia from Spain and, by extension, the independence of North Catalonia from France and that of other Catalan countries. The action started back in 1922 and it's still an ongoing activism. On the 25th of October 2017, after the Spanish government had threatened to suspend the Catalan autonomy through Article 155 of the Spanish Constitution, the UN intervened to soften the tornado. The Arab Spring started in Tunisia in late 2010, when the self-immolation of a street vendor in a provincial town of Sidi Bouzid sparked mass anti-government protests. Unable to control the crowds, President Ben Ali was forced to flee the country in January 2011 after 23 years in power. After Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Yemen and other Middle East countries started the Spring Uprising. The Iraqi protests, also called the October Revolution, are an ongoing series of protests that started decades ago. They are consisted of demonstrations, marches, sit-ins and civil disobedience. Obviously the government has responded, but aggressively, which led to almost 2,000 killed civilians, 2,500 arrests, and more than 20,000 injured people. The demands were mainly economic development and a corruption-free system. The Egyptian revolution started in January 2011 by a group of young activists who started online activism, riots, and civil resistance, all in order to fight police brutality, electoral fraud, corruption, and the high rate of unemployment. This led to the overthrowing of Mubarak's government and other extreme changes in the system. The Sudanese revolution started in December 2018 in aim of changing the economy that suffers from extreme austerity measures and high inflation. In addition to that, the dictatorship was easing the country from the inside, so citizens had to speak up for democracy and human rights. Not to forget that people died in sacrifice, so the activism fires up. And the war groups worldwide organize public protests. According to the French academic Dominique Régnier, between the 3rd of January and the 12th of April 2003, 36 million people across the globe took part in almost 3,000 anti-war protests, the demonstrations on the 15th of February 2003 being the largest and most prolific. Things have gone bad many times. We don't need to lose more souls. We hope governors listen actively and put their personal interests aside.
We're all humans.
Thanks for watching, and don't forget to leave a comment, like and subscribe to join my 10tube family.